Welcome, everyone, to The Intersection, the latest episode in a series on the IQT podcast where we discuss topics relating to the intersection of technology and national security. I'm very excited about today's guest, Dr. Scott Hsu, a senior advisor and lead fusion coordinator in the Office of the Undersecretary for Science and Innovation at the U.S. Department of Energy, or DOE as it's sometimes referred to. He is concluding his time as the program director at DOE's Advanced Research Projects Agency for Energy, where he led a portfolio of fusion energy R&D programs. His most recent paper was published in June of 2022 and co-authored with Sam Wurzel in AIP's Physics of Plasmas. The title of the paper was Progress Towards Fusion Energy Breakeven and Gain as Measured Against the Lawson Criterion. And we're going to talk about fusion today, which I think is possibly one of the most important topics out there in our society and at the intersection of technology and national security. So we're really lucky to have Dr. Hsu join us here today. So Scott, welcome. Why don't you start, if you don't mind, by telling us, any more about your background that I didn't cover that you think would be pertinent. And in particular, I think our listeners sometimes like to understand how you end up where you are today. So, tell us maybe a little bit about one or two decisions in terms of career choices that you made that sort of led you to where you are today.
Sure. Thank you, Steve, and to In-Q-Tel for inviting me here. Just wanted to say, too, that I've spoken to several of In-Q-Tel's staff, about fusion, so no stranger to In-Q-Tel. So for myself, I became interested in energy and fusion quite early on, even in early high school or possibly even earlier, doing school reports and the like. I studied plasma physics and fusion science starting in college and in graduate school, where I focused on fusion. I was an experimental plasma and fusion researcher for around 20 years before coming to Washington, D.C., and I did spend most of my prior career at Los Alamos National Laboratory. As far as being in my present role, I was kind of in the right place at the right time as an ARPA-E program director for its fusion programs. When the present administration decided to take an interest in seeing what could be done in accelerating fusion energy research and development in partnership with the private sector. And so, long story short, I was brought in to help plan a White House fusion summit back in March of this year, where I was announced by the Secretary of Energy, Jennifer Granholm, as the DOE lead fusion coordinator to help figure out a new U.S. strategy to accelerate fusion R&D.
Great. So I think most people understand what nuclear energy is, but I think the distinction between fission and fusion is sometimes not widely understood. So maybe you could start a conversation by just sort of telling our listeners a little bit about fission, which was sort of I think of it as the first iteration of nuclear power, and why fusion, because I presume you're on Team Fusion, why fusion is better if we can deliver it.
Yeah, so I'll just start by explaining, the fusion and fission are both nuclear physics processes. Fission is taking a heavier element like uranium and splitting it, in which case energy is released. And fusion is the opposite, taking a light element like hydrogen and combining it into a heavier element like helium, where energy is also released. And both release, a very large amount of energy compared to burning, chemically burning fossil fuels. And as far as, I've actually been shying away from doing these types of comparisons with fusion and fission. The truth is we need both, to get to our global energy goals. They each have different challenges. I mean, I do think it's true that fusion, if we can bring it to market, will have some easier issues to deal with, when it comes to some of the downsides, like nuclear waste, for example. And that's why people are excited about fusion, is that it's not that there aren't any risks, but that the risks are hopefully a little bit more manageable.
And you could say, maybe I'll just say, I will say that we're having sort of a nuclear renaissance here. That nuclear energy was obviously a big deal for power and energy in the 70s and 80s, but then people started moving on to other alternatives, and a lot of as is mentioned in the news today, a lot of the nuclear power plants had end of life dates of sometime around now here in the United States. And all of a sudden, with the current events going on with climate change, with the current events going on with conflicts in Europe between Russia and Ukraine, and the impact it's having on energy prices and energy availability there, uh, uh, people have come back around to maybe to appreciate the benefits of nuclear power more than they were a few years ago. And it's brought both fission and fusion, I think, back into the limelight, if you will. And a key element of what our favorite topic is, the intersection of national security and technology. Are you surprised at sort of the the evolution of the last couple of years to nuclear power coming back into vogue, if you will, or what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I'm not surprised. The facts are hard to argue with, right? I mean, nuclear does have a tremendous operating record, in terms of overall safety and reliability, capacity factor. It's always on availability, right? I mean, so those are some of its very positive attributes. And I think I'll just go back to saying, and these are borne out by studies done by scholars, right? I mean, the more diverse of an energy mix we have, including nuclear, the more secure our grid is, and the lower the overall system costs are. So, absolutely, I think nuclear is incredibly important to be part of our energy mix.
Okay.
And yeah,
So
and the
do
and
you
the events in Ukraine, of course, really really highlight that. I think nothing else needs to be said there.
Exactly. I mean, we've talked in past episodes on this podcast about the correlation between energy security and national security. And obviously fusion has an important role to play in that. Um, so, I think you mentioned that you started out your academic career focused on fusion. So not to imply that you're anything other than young, but implies that fusion's been around for a while. So, tell us what uh, given that the concept of nuclear fusion has been around for a while, what have been the obstacles that we need to solve from a sort of science and research perspective in order to deliver fusion as a reality? And where do we stand in sort of knocking those things down?
Yeah, so yeah, this is well trodden ground, and as you said, people have been working on this a long time. So scientifically and technically, actually, a recent report by the DOE Fusion Energy Sciences Advisory Committee called "Powering the Future" laid this out very clearly. Right, there's kind of three main science and technical areas that we still have to work on. First is achieving and sustaining a fusion plasma with adequate energy gain, right? Without that, really, we have nothing. But secondly, devising the needed materials and conceptual solutions to handling and controlling the extreme environment of a fusion plasma, right? It's like over 100 million degrees,
Yeah,
way hotter than the center of the sun. And finally, harnessing all that carbon free fusion energy, including closing the fuel cycle, such as breeding tritium fuel. I know we haven't had a chance to talk yet about exactly the types of fuel you would use. But those are the three main technical science and technical areas, and there's significant R&D remaining to be done in all three of those areas. But beyond the science and technology, there's also myriad challenges such as public engagement and acceptance, right? And nuclear knows this well. You really do need that for widespread deployment. Achieving an appropriate regulatory and licensing framework that doesn't stifle innovation and deployment. Finding the right entry markets at the right price and cost points. Addressing nuclear and cybersecurity challenges, supporting energy justice, and building a diverse workforce for a new energy industry. So these are things we have to pursue in parallel to bring fusion to commercialization.
yeah, I think those are all absolutely great points. Uh, um, So let's come back first to more of the science developments that you outlined here. And as I said in my introduction, you recently published a paper in June around progress towards fusion energy breakeven and gain as measured against the Lawson Criterion. So tell us first why what is exactly fusion energy breakeven mean, and why is that important? And then how does the Lawson Criterion fit in here?
Great, great. One of my favorite topics. So when we say fusion break even, I do want to be clear because this is something that maybe the scientific community hasn't been as clear as it should be. Um, Ultimately, what you need is that the fusion produces more energy than the total energy you used, right, for your entire system, meaning the energy you drew from the grid to operate your entire system, right? That's what we sometimes call engineering gain, right? It's
Yeah,
it's the it's the gain that actually matters if you can produce energy with it. But because fusion has been in a state of research, people have focused mainly on the fuel itself or the plasma, right? And that's something they call scientific gain, which is just the energy produced compared to how much energy you delivered to the fuel to heat it or to hold it there, right? That's the thing the physicists are focused on. So that's the thing that we're kind of on the cusp of right now is that scientific gain.
yeah,
Um, and the Lawson criterion, so actually, let me take a step back. So getting fusion to occur is relatively straightforward. We've known how to do that for nearly a century. But doing so with net positive energy has proven to be extremely difficult. The Lawson criterion, which was first worked out by J.D. Lawson of the UK in the 1950s, it is an elegantly simple mathematical statement of when the energy released from the fusion fuel exceeds all the energy losses from the fuel. And basically, this turns out to be that the product of the fuel density and the confinement time, which is how long you can hold the fuel or the energy in the fuel, that product must exceed a high threshold, very high threshold, at temperatures exceeding 100 million degrees. And so even Lawson in the 1950s recognized that the conditions are rather severe, kind of an understatement. And so when the Lawson criterion is met, we call that fusion ignition. And in
yeah.
that case, fusion can be self-sustaining. And this actually occurred for the very first time in a lab just last year at the National Ignition Facility at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory.
Right. And so let's brings up my next point, which is, you know, a lot of this research has been done in national labs funded by the U.S. government in some form, and as well as obviously labs outside the United States funded by governments outside the United States. But one of the other things that's changed is in the last several years is we've seen the injection of U.S. venture capital, private capital, into fusion companies with some very smart, very high-profile investors that we'll mention in a second, based on the belief that that fusion was now ready to be commercialized, if you will. The government does a great job, I think, of funding basic research, but the transition from basic research into the commercialization of that technology be delivered as a product or a service to consumers out in the world sometimes requires private capital and private companies built to do that. What's your observation about the state, if you will, of the startup community in fusion, and where are they helping? Where does the government work still need to be done? And then maybe we'll come back after that to some of the points you made previously around regulation and public acceptance as other things that need to happen here.
Yeah, so look, I'm personally very excited about the great growth in private sector activity. I think it's a great signal of several things, right? Firstly, I think it has to do with the scientific and technical maturity of the field that we did not have even 1 or 2 decades ago. So I think that's maybe the most important thing to recognize is that fusion is justifiably at that inflection point where we should move from a pure science enterprise to certainly more of an applied research activity and indeed working toward commercialization. We're not ready to commercialize yet because we still don't have a full blown working system at certainly and certainly not at the cost that you would need to compete in the energy markets. but I think we are at the right place to reconsider our entire national strategy, in how to accelerate fusion R&D. Um, yeah, so I mean, I think that's the main point. But but the other thing is the fact that the now the recognition of getting to global net zero on an urgent timescale, and so there's a significant market pull for a technology with the traits of fusion, right? That also didn't
Right.
necessarily exist even a decade or two ago. So I think the confluence of the technical readiness with the market pull is what has brought us to this point, where you have $5 billion of private capital going into fusion.
Exactly. For those listeners who didn't catch that, that was 5 billion with a B. And a couple of high-profile companies I'll just mention for people's awareness include Commonwealth Fusion, which counts Bill Gates amongst his investors. A company called Helion is another one that counts Sam Altman among others as investors, and a company called TAE in Southern California would be a third one that Goldman Sachs, for example, is an investor in. So it's not just real money; it's real money from very sophisticated, investors who are used to taking moonshots, if you will, and to some extent, you could characterize, the successful development and deployment of fusion reactors as still a little bit of a moonshot. Um, so there are scientific and technical hurdles that need to be overcome that we talked a little bit about here. Uh, um, let's come back to your other points, though, which was very important, which is there also has to be public acceptance and support in some form or another of this, and there also has to be regulatory support. And we had a regulatory hacker on previously on this podcast, Eli, who talks about the fact that the regulatory mechanisms that have been put in place to approve nuclear development have not improved anything. They've just become hurdles here. So, what are your thoughts on what may or may not happen to change that? And also, we could talk a little bit about what's your sense of timeline here when we think we might see some of these things happen.
Yeah, so regulation obviously is very, very important on multiple levels, and I think fusion has a golden opportunity to really learn from the experiences of fission,
Yep.
and to hopefully be in a better position. And first and foremost, right, I think there's a tension here. We want a very good regulatory framework, right, to engender public trust in the safety of fusion. But at the same time, we want a framework that's right sized, right, and that doesn't
Yep.
stifle, innovation, as I think I mentioned earlier. And certainly the licensing process, needs to be a reasonable and one that is streamlined, right? It doesn't choke off, doesn't cause companies to go bankrupt. Um,
Right.
so, like I said, I think fusion has a golden opportunity right now, because we still have time. We still need time to solve the science and technology and to get to demonstrations and deployment. In parallel, we have to get this right, and that does include a public engagement, right? So, the NRC is already working on a possible regulatory framework for fusion. In fact, there's legislation already enacted, suggesting or saying that they need to have something in place by 2027. I believe they're on track to do that, if not sooner. But like I said, I think we want to do this in a way that does have public engagement and engenders the public trust. Right. One thing that's that some people are making very clear is, yeah, we want to move fast, but you don't want to move fast at the expense of not bringing people on board. In the end, you'll
Right.
just waste more time. You can waste decades if you don't have public support.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think there's a couple, key points, that we've hit on, but just to highlight it to sort of sum up this conversation, which is one of the advantages I think of nuclear fusion is it doesn't have the production of nuclear or production of waste materials that fission does. That has been, I think, one of the chief public obstacles to the adoption of fission here in the United States. Whether it's 3 Mile Island or Chernobyl or Japan, there's these images of nuclear disasters, and I don't think we as a society are great at assessing and managing risk of low likelihood but highly catastrophic events occurring. And the nice thing about fusion is it doesn't produce this waste, so it's cleaner, and it's probably perceived to be safer for society. And then the second point I would make that I think you brought up is the market pull phrase. I really like that, which is given the energy challenges we're facing as a society, whether it's climate change to just scarcity of energy to some of the challenges that we've had deploying and transmitting energy from some of the other alternatives that we've invested in over this last decade, there is more and more of a groundswell building of interest in and thought that, hey, nuclear maybe could be one of the key elements to solving this challenge that we're in as a society. And so if you have a perceived safer version of the technology that still has a lot of the benefits that's generating the market pull here, if we can solve the scientific obstacles and if we can figure out the cost deployment in such a way that it's profitable for people to deliver this could be a very impactful, very significant development for our society, which I think is why all of us are so excited about fusion these days. Did I miss anything there in that
No,
last
no, you
information?
you you got it just right. I think. Look, that's the reason I got into fusion, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it is indeed the type of energy that we hope we can get, and yeah, I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah. So if things did go right, if we solved the scientific problems the way we think we might, if we got public support and regulatory approval, what's your sense of the timeline of when we could start seeing fusion reactors actually, delivering energy to society? Because it's not next year. I just want to set everyone's
Yeah.
expectations on
So this is always the $1 million question, and
that.
that's an appropriate statement because it does come down to money. uh,
Yeah.
when people ask me how long do you think it'll take, I think maybe the better answer is how much money will it take. And as part of preparing for the White House event that I mentioned earlier back in March, we were basically asked, by the White House, what can we accelerate, right? Fusion development. Can we be ready for, say, pilot scale demonstrations, on a decadal time scale, right? That's what we talked about at the White House event. And let me just be clear, it's going to be challenging, right? It's going to take at least it's going to take many, many billions of dollars to do the R&D to and to construct even a single pilot scale facility, right? Which itself may cost several $billion. So I think we have to, and that's why the involvement of the private sector is so exciting because with the private sector partnerships, we think we can actually get the amounts of funding that are required. As a
Yeah.
purely scientific government program thus far, we just simply haven't had access to the amounts of funding needed to do it on an aggressive timescale like that. So, what I would say is we have ambitions to have pilot demonstrations in the 30s, but a lot of things have to go right for that to happen.
Yeah, great. Well, that's I think that's a very realistic and grounded answer to that question. So I appreciate that. Let me ask you this: stepping back to look at the global picture, we've talked a lot about where we are here in the United States when it comes to fusion. Do you have any observations about where other regions of the world might be? Europe is also, I'm sure, looking at fusion. Do you have a sense? Are they ahead or behind us? Is China ahead or behind us? I don't know if you have any opinions on that, but I think our listeners will be curious about that.
Yeah, sure. So indeed, it's a global endeavor. Maybe I'll just start by saying that many governments around the world obviously have supported fusion R&D for a very long time, and most notably, all the ITER partners. Right, ITER is the multinational tokamak being built in France. The seven main partners are the EU, Japan, South Korea, China, Russia, India, and of course the US. And all of them have significant domestic R&D activities and capabilities. The UK is really, I think, planting a flag in the ground, if you will. They recently announced a very ambitious goal of an operating fusion pilot plant called STEP by 2040. The UK is also second only to the US in its number of privately funded fusion companies. Um, I'll just say, while fusion has enjoyed great international cooperation for most of its history, after being declassified in the late 1950s, make no mistake, it is now becoming a true international competition. And whether the question of US leadership, what I would say is in terms of the science and innovation and the breadth of fusion approaches being pursued, I think the US is still in a leadership position. But in terms of facility construction and, like really national scale publicly backed efforts, the U.S. has been falling behind for the past several decades. For example, the largest fusion experiments being constructed in the U.S. now are private, not public, and that's not true in nearly every other country, pretty much every other country.
Good. Well, that's actually a very interesting perspective, so I appreciate that. We're coming up near the end of our time here. I always like to ask or conclude with a couple of questions. Any final takeaways that you think our listeners should keep in mind regarding the importance of how this technology will play a key role, in both our national security and our society going forward?
Yeah, well, so we didn't really have a chance to talk about the possibility of fusion, being a really disruptive technology. I think it has a good chance of being a disruptive technology, both in energy and for defense and space applications. And I was thinking, I thought I'd mention that I've been watching the show For All Mankind on Apple TV, and I just finished watching the first episode. Sorry, the first season.
Mhm.
And in nearly every episode of that season, I thought about two things. First, the dramatic technological changes for humanity that could occur if we had a serious international competition in fusion. Like the show portrayed for the moon. And then,
Right.
secondly, how fusion itself could have made a lot of things so much easier in that first season.
Right. No, that's very true. I come back to the comments I made at the beginning of the episode here. I think there are a few topics out there that are as important as fusion to talk about. And I think because it is a complicated, physics application that not everyone is confident or comfortable about talking about it, but it really, the progress that the community makes in terms of delivering on the promise of fusion over the next decade, or 15 years, even, could be one of the most fundamental determinants of how successful our society, our economy, and our ability to defend ourselves from a national security perspective. All three of those things are very dependent, I think, on continued successful progress in fusion. So you and your colleagues are working on this. We all owe a thank you to here. Um, where can our listeners, if they get intrigued by what they've just heard, find out more about you and your work? And is there anything you're currently working on now or thinking about in the future that you'd like to highlight?
Yeah, sure. So I do have a lot of fusion related links and postings at my LinkedIn webpage. So I think that's probably easy to find, may be of interest to this audience. The main thing I'm working on at the moment is to help launch a major new DOE public-private partnership program to support, what we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Bringing the public and private sectors together to work toward timely commercial fusion energy to accelerate that. We are modeling that program in some ways after the NASA Commercial Orbital Transportation Services program that enabled SpaceX.
Oh, that's terrific. I look forward to that. I'll hit you up on LinkedIn after this episode here. So, well, thank you, Scott, for your time here. Really appreciate it. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in to today's episode of The Intersection. Please make sure you subscribe to the IQT podcast so you don't miss out on our future content, and leave us a review or comment to let us know what you think or what content you'd be interested in to see us cover in the future of our podcast. I'd also like to encourage you to check out IQT's website at www.iqt.org to explore more content about cutting-edge technology to support and deliver insights and capabilities essential for national security impact. And again, thank you to Scott, our guest, and to you, our listeners, for joining us at the intersection of national security and technology today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve.
Produced by Heartcast Media.